Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you're watching or listening. Welcome to another edition of the Draft Crush Show. My name is Edgar Salmingo Jr., joined by the illustrious Ricky Rains. Ricky, how are you?
Illustrious. Wow,
The
that's a
illustrious.
nice adjective for the day, man. I missed you last episode, so I'm very happy to have you
I
back
missed you
here as
too.
my co-host and have you kind of lead the ship for me, so that I don't have to do that anymore, and people aren't subjected to extra Ricky Bow body that they don't really need in their life. But how was your week, Edgar? Are you ready to do this thing today? We got a really good guest, man.
I do. So, we as a show, we've had like so many ideas and so many brilliant things, but we also have the humility to understand there's some things that we don't know, or there are some really, really bright, talented minds in this space, and we want to bring them on because they do great work. And so, should I lead them in, Ricky?
Yeah, 100%. Let's bring him
Yeah,
in.
yeah. So let's bring in Devin Jackson from the Philadelphia Inquirer. Devin, how are you?
Yeah, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on, guys, and looking forward to talking about the couple of prospects we're gonna discuss. And like I was telling you before this, definitely enjoy this time of year. When everyone's focused on the NFL draft, focused on the next group of prospects, and this is the best time to talk about it. And we're about a month and a half away from the NFL draft, and so many things still can happen until then. So excited to talk through it and enjoying you guys on the show.
Devin,
Yeah.
does it make us all a little bit nutty that we enjoy this time of year? Because I mean, honestly, there's so much going on, man. And like it's rumors flying around. You're up late at night. I'm on like my third canteen of coffee already today. Like, are we a little bit off for enjoying this as much as we do?
I would say yes and no. I mean, like, I don't think people understand like how deep you can go with this. It just feels like, the general fan or general consensus is you should worry about only the first round prospects. But as we know, the day two and day three prospects are what make a championship team. A championship level team. You look at obviously the Eagles are a team that I'm familiar with. Quarterback is a second round pick. Star receiver is a second round pick. Several guys on that defense were day two picks. You look at Cooper DeJean, second round pick. Milton Williams, I think he was a third round pick. Even Josh Sweat, a fourth round pick. So many of the teams that we're all fans of or cheer for or watch. A majority of them are made up of day two and day three picks naturally because there's more picks in each of those days, but also you can't get first round talent every year, and you got to be able to build out the depth of your team. And I think, that's what makes this draft process is unique because you're not just getting familiar with the top 50, 100 guys. Sometimes it's 200, 250, 300. You're getting familiar with them just because they're a good portion of them are going to kind of go under the radar and turn out some really good NFL careers.
So Devin, before we jump into some of our draft crushes here, like we said at the very beginning, like I mean, let's just be transparent. Ricky and I literally wrote out like a wish list of guests that we would love to come on. And Devin, like you're one of the most talented, one of the most fun people in this space. So maybe for people who don't know you, maybe you can tell, like, this is something that we've asked all of our guests, but like maybe tell us a story. Like, how did you fall in love with the draft, and like how did you get to where you are today? Because we all have a draft story too.
Yeah, so for me, I grew up, watching the NFL, watching, a lot of sports, but specifically NFL and college football. And, for me, I didn't really get started into the draft space until the end of the 2019, cycle. I played football in college for Lindenwood University, and I played tight end and fullback. So I kind of had that base of knowledge of college coverages, of college schemes, of how to block a guy, that's a shade outside of you, think all those nuts and bolts of football. So I took a lot of what I learned there in college and wanted to apply it in some sort of way because I just had that knowledge, but wasn't really using it. I was in the journalism field, and at the time I started, I was working at a TV station, but was mostly covering news. So it was kind of an outlet for me. I started watching it into 2019, end of the 2019 cycle into 2020, and then obviously we know COVID happened, so that's when it really started to kick in high gear for me. So I've been following the draft closely since that 2020 class, and pretty much throughout then. So for me, I just started watching some guys over the summer and kind of getting familiar with the next crop of names. And then from there, I really started to dive in and continue to follow the draft and, watch guys during the season, watch guys after the season, and try to watch as many guys as I can. And for me, I found like in this particular space at the time, a lot of people weren't talking about the small school prospects or the guys that they're, in the group of 5 prospects. Everyone was kind of talking about the power 4 prospects, top 50 to 100 prospects coming from power 5 schools. So for me, that's kind of where I started to make my mark and understanding what these players are able to do. And I think just for me, my general focus is, focusing on what players bring to a team, not necessarily, focus on the weaknesses. Like I understand like the weaknesses is something that you got to be cognizant of. But for NFL teams, like, they're aware of what players aren't, are able to do. But sometimes I think we kind of get caught up in trying to put all these prospects in one bucket, that because they weren't able to do it at the college level doesn't mean they can't do it at all. So that's why I kind of focus on, the positives of it, what they can bring to the table, what their skill set is, how they translate to the NFL level, things like that, versus like, trying to point out all the negatives in their game. Because I think that's an important part of the process. But still, like teams obviously going to try and develop those things that prospects aren't as strong at. So for me, that's really not my call. You know what I'm saying? Like I understand, especially if you're taking a first round guy, you want to make sure you understand all the things that maybe they aren't as strong at.
Right.
But at the end of the day, you're taking a guy because of the potential you see in him and what he can be in 3-4 years down the road versus what he is right now anyway. So yeah, that's kind of the synopsis. I've been covering the draft. I think this is my 5th or 6th full cycle. So it's been fun to kind of see all these players kind of cycle through. A lot of those guys that I started watching back in 2020 are now going through their first and second contracts. So it's kind of fun to see the process through.
Now you got this new crop of players that you got to get familiar with, right? And you get like, it's like a blank canvas again. Now you're not just looking at progression and development from the guys that you've already been scouting for a few years. Now you're getting these new shiny pieces in here and you get to kind of evaluate them from a whole different angle. I love what you said, though, about focusing more. And it's not removing the negatives or the deficiencies or limitations, whatever you may call it. It's not about removing those. But a team isn't drafting a guy because he can't do something, right? Like a team is drafting a guy because of what he can do. So if you can highlight that, if you can find those fits, if you can find how does he win and what team needs that kind of skill set, I think that's a terrific approach to it. And that's the way that me and Edgar kind of do this thing as well. Edgar, do you want to introduce this prospect that we're going to get? Now, before we do, though, Devin, these are guys that you are high on, correct? Like these aren't just guys that you can talk about, because you could talk about just about anybody in this draft class, man. But these are guys that you actually do have like an affinity for, right?
Yeah. These are for me. Mike Green is like a guy that I feel like I was like very, very early on. I liked his, and he was a guy that was a rotational player last year at Marshall. And I remember I was watching. I just talked about this at the combine, but I was watching Elijah Alston, who went on to play at Miami. He transferred over. And I kept seeing Mike Green pop. I was like trying to figure out like who's this number 15 was, because he was a guy that I didn't know much about. There was limited metrics, limited data on him because he didn't play like starter level snaps. But he made a lot of interesting plays. I saw his fluidity, his bend. So Mike Green, for me throughout this process has been a guy that I've been a big fan of. And then Jacob Parrish is a guy that I was a little bit later on, like I think end of November, early December is when I started to recognize him. And I think I was watching a team. I think I was watching Iowa State against Kansas State, and I kept seeing him make plays and kept doing things and being in the slot and being as an outside corner. Was making plays at both sides. So that's kind of the story behind both of these guys and what they bring. But yeah, they're two of my favorites in this class, and what they bring to the table. I think they're guys that can be day one starters.
I'm very excited for that because Jacob Parrish is a guy that I'm very high on too. So That was music to my ears when you said you wanted to do Jacob Parrish. I was like, thank you, finally.
Yeah, let's get right into it. So first of all, we got quite a few people watching and listening. So if you're out there, thank you for watching. If you could like or subscribe, Doug, I see you out there with your comments. Thank you for joining. But for everybody else, thank you for your support. As we get into our first draft crush, which is Jacob Parrish, and I know Ricky just alluded to it, Devin, but you just to be honest, you make Ricky look good because Ricky really likes Jacob Parrish. And when you say it, it's like, okay, Ricky can't be a dummy that he is. He has to be credible now because Devin said the same thing.
Just positive reinforcement. I can still be a dummy, but at least somebody else feels the same.
So we got, a tail of tape. We just had our combine last week, depending on when you're listening to this. But if you can see on the screen, or if you're just listening, we got a shorter corner. He's not a tall corner, but 5'9", 191. But he had an impressive combine with a 4.3 40, 1.5 10-yard split, 37-inch vertical, almost 11-foot broad jump. So very, very impressive. 30-inch arms again. So like he's a little bit on the smaller side. He doesn't have the massive arm length that you're looking at. Maybe from a physical profile, Devin, anything that pops off the screen or things that you notice, especially from coming off the combine, about his physical attributes?
Yeah, I think you could see on tape that he moved explosively, and I think the testing only really confirmed that. And I think you see on his film his recovery ability, his recovery speed, and he has a second gear that he can get into. And again, a lot of teams like I know that study the 40-yard dash and get data. They want to see what the flying 20 is for a corner. Those final 20 yards. Can you make up that time? Is it faster than your first 40? And I think with Jacob Parrish, he showed that speed can carry out throughout a rep. And obviously there are going to be times where it's 4 or 5 seconds down the field. He might be in a trail position, and I just find that that I think the speed matches what you see on tape. Is a guy that doesn't get panicked in those situations when he's working downfield. Is physical enough to play in tight quarters and play press man coverage. And I think, what really stands out to him specifically is his feet. They're very patient. He's very composed. You see in this clip down here, like he does a really good job of locating the football and closing. I think that's a big time attribute, and some of the ball skills that he can show while he's working downfield. But I really like Parrish, and I think he's a guy that probably is a day one nickel. Coming in and at 5'9", it's probably a nickel at the NFL level. But we've seen guys and I've heard some, or while I was at the combine, I heard some comparisons to what he brings to the table in terms of nickel wise to Trent McDuffie. What McDuffie is able to do at the NFL level. How he's physical and has great ball skills. So I have heard some, and I don't think it's a direct comp. I do think, some of his movement skills kind of remind me of Trent McDuffie.
I'm saying no way, not because I don't believe it, Devin, but because that's exactly who I've been saying for like over a month now. Is that Trent McDuffie was what I saw. It's and you know what also reminded me of him a little bit when we talk about like the physical profile as well. His arms aren't long, right? For like just a regular like length standard, but proportionally, I mean, he's got pretty good length for his frame as a 5'9.5" guy, having almost 31-inch arms. And I think there was some discrepancy with the measurements between the combine and the Senior Bowl. What it was like a half-inch difference, I think, almost across the board that we saw with a lot of these prospects. And I think that his Senior Bowl measurement, he was a tick over 31 inches. And you compare that with some of these other guys like a Dorian Strong. I believe he had a longer arm length than Dorian Strong, who's 6'1", 6'2". So like, while he's shorter, he also uses that length. And I paused this clip here because that arm length and what you were talking about so perfectly, that recovery speed, he times that, man. Like he can be a little bit late, but he's very sticky in coverage. But even if he's just that hair behind, his arm length and his speed, his recovery speed do make up for it. And he gets his hand in there and he makes plays on a regular basis.
Yeah, he's a guy that does a really nice job of staying attached at the hip. I think that's so important, especially if you're playing more of that nickel role. We saw kind of with Cooper DeJean this year with the Eagles is his ability to stay in the hip pocket of receivers, and I really like his instincts too. He's a guy that can understand to seize the field well, and I think at nickel you got to be able to. And I know people kind of talk about playing on an island, at outside corner, but I feel like nickel, it's especially hard because a guy has a two-way go. So you got to be able to stay in the hip pocket, be able to undercut routes, as you see here. What he did on that end route is stay attached at the hip and stay right there in the hip pocket. And I think keeping your, so I know like a lot of DBs are taught like keep that, outside arm, around the waist of receivers. It's kind of out of the view of referees if they're on the sideline referee. So I think he's gotten pretty savvy with that ability. You see right here in this rep, exactly that. He uses his inside hand to attack the football and has that outside arm wrapped around his waist, so that if he does miss the football, he still has a tackle secured. So I think it's one of the things that's kind of textbook, and you see in his film, his ability to stay attached to the hip and be savvy about it. But I think the biggest thing is that he's able to disrupt the timing of receivers. You saw that jam there on I think that was Ted McMillan. His ability to get into the body of receivers and be physical enough and get away with maybe some pulls on the back of jersey because he's in good position and the referees are kind of in a position they can't see it cleanly.
Yeah,
Can I ask a silly question to the both of you?
Mm-hmm.
So I know that, because size, and we just talked about arm length, like maybe he projects as a nickel, but then you both had mentioned like again, not like a comp, like he's not going to be Trent McDuffie, but you mentioned Trent McDuffie, and I know he plays outside. So what makes a player more suited for nickel? Than I know, like for some schemes, nickel's now become the new base, but what makes someone like Jacob Parrish more of a nickel slot guy versus say an outside corner?
Yeah, I think it's mostly to do with the size. I think a lot of NFL teams want guys that are a little bit bigger to handle some of the outside receivers that you're facing in today's game. Think about Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, and how physical they are. You got to be able to be big enough to handle some of that. So I think with Parrish in particular, I do think there is a little bit of the size question mark because you want a guy that can be a little bit bigger as an outside corner. So that's why I'm kind of projecting him at nickel, just because I think I think the size is going to ding him a little bit, but two, I think he's extremely fast, as you see. You saw on this 40 and even some of the recovery speed. I think he's a guy that you can rely on and at the nickel position, and be able to handle some of those shiftier, quicker slot receivers, as opposed to a guy that's a little bit bigger as an outside corner.
Yeah, okay. I agree. In the short area quickness, that lateral agility that he also shows as well really does bode well for him on the inside. Because as you said, like the receiver has two choices, right? You're not just playing on that boundary, but that the taller, bigger receivers, the more physical receivers can present a little bit more of a challenge for a guy who's 5'9", 191 pounds. I think that he's physical enough from like a mentality standpoint and the way that he plays. We were just talking about like his press technique of being able to disrupt a guy off the line. This was one of my favorite reps. This was against Houston, where he just completely disrupted that. He can do it. It's not that he's unable to do it, but at the next level, do they want him to? Now, we're Carolina Panthers fans, so there's some similarity, if you will, and not the way that they play. I wouldn't make this comp, but the way that Cho Smith-Wade was a outside boundary corner at Washington State for the majority of his career, went to the Senior Bowl, kind of put some tape out there of being able to play nickel, showed that short area quickness, showed that mobility. And the Panthers have kind of used him as their de facto nickel because we had Dane Jackson playing nickel. So that's a whole different conversation. But I think that that's maybe where Jacob Parrish can say, hey, look, I'm able to do this. I don't know that he can't play outside, but I think that the versatility to do both, I think he could be a really nice chess piece for a guy like Mikey Sainristil isn't a guy that can necessarily play outside on a regular basis, but I also don't think you get terrified if there's some post-snap movement or motions where he's going to end up covering somebody else. I think you feel pretty good about his abilities, right? And Jacob Parrish reminds me a little bit of that, where ideally you want to get him inside and play nickel. And the nickel position in the NFL right now isn't like this afterthought anymore. It's also becoming a very important, aggressive piece of a defense. So I think that having a really good nickel is is a plus. I don't think of it as like a negative that he can only play inside.
And so I asked that because I know that again, this is just me as an amateur, not like you guys, but I hear like power slots and big slots are now the rage, or tight ends moving to that area. And so I was curious, like, does that worry you if the game is moving towards these bigger slots? Like, does he have that outside, like I think you already alluded to it, Ricky, but outside inside versatility, because teams are always evolving. And so once they match up and they say, like, okay, we're going to smaller guys on the outside. And once they catch up to that, now we're going to put the smaller guys on the inside. And so I was just curious about how you felt his fit is if, going inside now that a lot of teams are moving towards more versatile pieces in the slot.
Yeah, I think it kind of really depends on what your defensive scheme is, obviously. But, I think also, like, we talk about nickels and being a little bit smaller guys, but I also think, some of what Parrish put on tape against bigger guys, bodes well against tight ends. You got to be physical with tight ends. You got to be able to stay in their hip pocket and be able to secure the tackle over the middle of the field on those in cutting routes. So I think, when you kind of take it, as a grain of salt, like, yes, there's some more big slots there, but those big slots aren't going to be moving as fast as some of those quicker twitch guys. And he's shown the ability to stay in the hip pocket against those quicker guys on the outside. So I think it bodes well, for him as in a nickel as well. So I think with Parrish, you see the size profile, but also the physicality. I think that part of it and what he brings, being able to jam receivers at the line, being a willing tackler in the run game, and just generally being a physical player at the line of scrimmage, I think is going to bode well to playing nickel and playing against some of those tight ends and bigger slots to disrupt some of the timing.
Willing tackler this is the first clip I always think of when I think of willing tackler. I mean, he just explodes on that receiver. And if I remember correctly, too, in that Arizona State game, he had a couple tackles on Cam Scatterbo. That was one of the more difficult running backs to bring down. I mean, I don't remember how many broken tackles the guy had this year. It was somewhere close to like 1 million, 1.5 million maybe. But I mean, he was an absolute like load to bring down. And Jacob Parrish wasn't scared of that assignment. And I think that mentality also really plays into it, right, Devin?
Yeah, as a nickel, you got to be a willing tackler too, because you're going to be playing closer to the line of scrimmage. You're going to be put in those one-on-one isolated situations sometimes, on the perimeter and as a run defender. And he shows that ability to be able to do that, be able to, kind of block shed and be able to make tackles in the open field.
So you guys have waxed poetic about a lot of the things that he does and does well. I know, Devin, you alluded to this earlier about things that you might not have shown at the college level. Doesn't mean it doesn't translate, or doesn't mean you can't do it at the NFL level. So what are some areas that you see for Jacob Parrish that you haven't seen or still developing at the college level that you'd love to see, take to the next level when he gets to the NFL?
Yeah, I think I would like to see him a little bit more in some of those zone situations as a nickel. You saw it more as an outside corner, and when he was playing in the nickel or in the slot, he was playing in more man situations. So I'd like to see him be able to drop into zone coverage, be able to read some of the eyes of the quarterback, and be able to make some plays on the football, more primarily in zone coverage. So I just would like to see him a little bit more in those zone coverage situations. Considering like a lot of the NFL is starting to move towards that, and I think it's important to be able to showcase that skill set and that ability. So that was one thing for me that kind of stood out, and I think being able to manage some of the aggressiveness and physicality that he brings, because yes, while that's a big positive, you still got to be able to play in tight quarters and be able to do so without committing a penalty. So. Those would be the two things that I left away from this film that I feel like either he would need to prove at the NFL level or something he had to be cognizant of.
It's a great point, because if I remember correctly, I think he had like 7 penalties last year. He was flagged 7 times. And he's a handsy guy. He's a physical player, but you do got to kind of reel that in, because those mistakes can end up costing you as well. So we talked a little bit about scheme fit, about what he can do. So Devin, do you have anything in mind as far as like team fit or a specific kind of defensive scheme where you think that he can maybe really flourish, right, and reach his absolute ceiling as a prospect?
Yeah, I look at more the nickel based teams. I feel like a scheme like the Eagles, like the Fangio type scheme, will make a lot of sense for him because some of the versatility that he has. I think the Panthers could be a good landing spot too, just
Yeah, I was
because
hoping
of
you were going to say that.
that inside out versatility. I look at a team like the Bengals that could really use his skill set and what he brings to the table. Because I know their nickel situation is a little questionable, a little up in the air. So those are a couple of teams to me that come to mind. Like I feel like he would thrive in a system that asks him to play the nickel position, that asks him to move in on tight ends and slot receivers. But maybe there are some scenarios where he can bump out on the outside and play some shorter zone coverage zone, cover two, or cover six if you're trying to split the field in half. I think there's a lot you can do with Parrish and what he brings to the table. So I think a nickel based team makes a lot of sense for him.
So we pulled up, or do you want me to talk about this, Ricky?
Yeah, these are your analytics, man. You're the brain guy. So you go through all this and explain what all these red and green boxes on my screen are.
Yeah, these are not my analytics. So just sharing analytics. So like I think when we come, so just so you know, Devin, like when we talk about draft prospects, we want to talk about all facets of their profile. This is more production and more advanced analytics that are out there. So you can see Jacob Parrish on this. This one is from Football Insights. You can see him here. I think they compared this from previous corners that were drafted, red being lower than average and green being higher than average. So you can see here, I know it's covered by our beautiful graphics, Ricky, but the left side is his performance. No, you're good. You're good. His production in man, and the right side is his production in zone. So you can see, which doesn't really line up because we were just talking and we saw these clips of it. But on the left side, you can see he spent 38% of his time in man and 50% of his time in zone. When he was in man, this is yards per coverage snap. He gave a 1.29 yards per coverage snap. And then we have also a red 14.1% in terms of forced incompletions. But in zone, he shined 50% of the time. We've got greens and yards per coverage snap and quarterback rating when past that. And then again, just a little bit below average when it comes to forced incompletion. So that's his analytic profile. This is another one. This is from Football Insights. Just yards per coverage snap for zone and man. Again, comparing it to previously drafted corners, you can see them kind of faded of how they are, but he fell below average in terms of yards per coverage snap in zone and in man. Looks like he's in the same realm as Ennis Rakestraw from last year, I think. And then right below him, the aforementioned Mike Sainstrell is right there.
Yeah, and it's interesting that Mikey Sainristil and then Max Melton from Rutgers, because those are two players that I think are relatively similar in like how they played in college and then what you kind of project them at the league. That both have that inside out flexibility, right? Both incredible athletes, really good ball skills. So it's interesting to see them down there because normally that bottom left quadrant makes you feel icky about a player, right? Like you never want to see somebody in the bottom left. You always want top right. But I don't hate the company that he's in there with the rest of those players.
Mm-hmm. And the last graphic I have is from my good friend Kent at MathBomb. Just showing his athletic profile from this combine this last weekend. You can see all the green as a RAS or as a athletic profile in the 93rd percentile. I know Devin mentioned his recovery speed and his last speed. His splits were 90, 96 percentile, 87 percentile, and his explosion 80 to 92 percentile. So just a very explosive athlete, obviously below average in terms of size, but he definitely made up for it in athleticism. So that's his complete analytic and athletic profile.
Devin, what is your thoughts on the relative athletic score? Because, this is a polarizing thing on its own, right? Without even getting into specific players and how they grade out with it. I think there's a misconception, at least from my understanding, right? And so I'd love your opinion on this. I think people think of it as like a prospect grade, and that's not what it is. It's comparing percentiles of the position that they play to the players that have measured in and tested in that same position group. And so this is top like 10% or something like that, I think, for the green. And then that 50 to 70% is or top 20, right, for the green. 50 to 70 is the yellow. And then the bottom 50%, bottom half is the red. So it's not like a bad, medium, good. It's just the percentiles that it's measured in, correct?
Yeah, I think, with RAS, I think it's a great tool to see how these guys match up historically. So I think that that's kind of how I use it is like, all right, historically speaking, this is how they tested against the rest of the people at their position, that came before them, that's in the same draft class as them. So I think, you got to be careful with this sometimes because just because you're, an anomaly positively or negatively as an athlete does not mean or indicate the success that you have. Obviously teams tend to go with guys that are a little bit more physically anomalies, especially in the early rounds. But once you get to late day 2, early day 3, I don't think it matters as much in terms of what your RAS score is, because teams have their own, tracking data, their own GPS data. They bring these guys in for workouts. They see them work out in person. So just because you don't test as well athletically against some of your predecessors doesn't mean that you won't go on to have a good NFL career.
Well said. All right, so we get into this next guy.
Yeah, so that closed the door on Jacob Parrish. Great prospect. We're all fans of him. I guess before I close the door, Devin, I don't know how much you do projections or rankings. We built our own kind of consensus based on some of the mainstream media out there. He's hovering around 100, so that's around third round ish, end of third round ish area. Where would you draft him? Where would you feel comfortable? Or how high do you think he goes?
Yeah, I would draft him probably in the top 75. I feel pretty comfortable drafting him in that range. And I can understand if a team views him as a nickel, he's not going to get selected as high just naturally because, nickels they haven't caught up yet in terms of, what the draft value is for those guys. But I have a third round grade on him. I think he's a guy that makes a lot of sense in that third and fourth round range. That a guy, the team can get at the very least a starting nickel. And maybe they give him a shot at outside corner, but I would say around that top 75 range is where I'd be comfortable taking him.
Sounds good.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Let's jump into the next one. A lightning rod of a prospect in terms of where the opinions are and whispers that we're hearing about Mike Green, but the dynamic edge player out of Marshall. Devin, maybe you could give us your little elevator speech of who is Mike Green and why is he rising up draft boards, or why is he so high on consensus boards in terms of an edge prospect?
Yeah, the first thing you look for in an edge prospect is how they get off the football and how they move. And Mike Green moves at a different speed. Obviously he's playing against prospects that most of them aren't making it to the NFL level. But even a step up in competition, when he played against Ohio State, when he played against Virginia Tech, he was a force. He was a disruptive force. And to me, it really all starts with his, ability to bend the corner, his explosiveness, his first step, and the ability to use his length as well to create some separation from guys. And we're seeing some of those Senior Bowl clips, but you see that cross chop there and his ability to turn the corner and get flat to the line of scrimmage and go after the quarterback. That's one of the first things that you want to see in an NFL edge rusher. Is how does he move when he's turning the corner? And he does a really good job of doing that. And India does a nice job working back inside. And I think and certainly we'll discuss a little bit more, where he can grow more is as a run defender, but at the very least, what you're getting as a pass rusher and a guy that can get to the football, that has a nose for the football, gets involved in a lot of plays. This ability to be slippery in between the tackles and be able to work on the inside and outside track. All those things to me make him such a really good prospect. A guy that you saw glimpses of it from his tape in 2023 when he got some opportunities to do so, and even coming back in 2024 as being the main guy that teams needed to worry about. It felt like he elevated his game in the hot motor that he runs with. Just really stands out. And even if he doesn't get there home with his initial rush, you start to see him being able to work some secondary and third moves as well, and just he always has his nose in the backfield, whether it's as a pass rusher, as a run defender, although, I think he could do a little bit better of holding his holding himself at the line of scrimmage a little bit better and using some of that length to stand his ground and not try to win with speed on run plays as much. But as a player, as an athlete, and as a pass rusher, he's one of the better ones in this class.
It's tough to not compare players like within the same class, right? Because you're trying to like make this like individual evaluation and give the grades on the players themselves. But like when I watch a guy like James Pierce Jr., who I like a lot, the get off on the line of scrimmage, that first step, the explosiveness and the speed for James Pierce obviously stands out. Mike Green to me is very similar in that regard, but he has so much more bend than James Pierce. Like he can really turn that corner where I think that James Pierce is a little bit like tight hipped. He seems a little bit more upright of a player. With Mike Green, outside of Abdul Carter, man, like I don't know that there is anybody with that explosive athleticism coming off the edge. That's just the way that I saw it. You mentioned his length, and that's something that people have looked at almost as like a ding on him from these measurements because his length, 32-inch arms. It's not the Donovan Ezeraku with the 34-inch. It's not even the Nick Scorton, right? Does that doesn't give you any pause then? These measurables that you're seeing here from Mike Green, you're totally comfortable with him as like an NFL edge player?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the thing with arm length, I think sometimes that we get a little bit caught up in if they're not over 32 inches, and I think it's not so much in you having that ability, but also how you use it. And to me, I find that he's able to use it effectively in a way that he's not relying on it. He's not relying on a long arm. He has active hands. And I don't think I don't think I have seen the tackle on film that was simply able to out leverage him. Just because he didn't have long enough arms, if that makes sense. So I find that that's not really his play anyway. Surely, of course, you need those arms to be able to lock out and be able to defend the run. But I think with Mike Green, he does such a nice job of being slippery at the point of attack, of being able to swipe hands away, to be able to use some of his bend and athleticism, and then using the rip moves to get past offensive linemen. I find that, like, yes, it's not as his arms aren't as long as some of the other players in this class, but I find that he does a nice job in utilizing them, but not just relying on them solely.
So I think we have to talk about the elephant in the room with Mike Green, though, right? And that's that there is a significant potential character red flag on his profile. You can see here he started his career at the university, or collegiate career at the University of Virginia. True freshman, got a minimal amount of time. Is still had a little bit of an impact even in those 38 snaps played. He got a sack, 2 tackles, 2 quarterback pressures. That's relatively impressive. But then 2022 he transferred to Marshall. The wording here for me, Devin, was really interesting. And I think that there's people that try to like really dig into the wording of things and how somebody says things. Mike Green himself said that he was suspended from Virginia and ended up transferring to Marshall. The way that Virginia worded it was that he was no longer active with the program. No details. And then reports come out, start surfacing, and it's rumors, first of all, and then like more concrete type of substantiating opinions. But there were some sexual assault allegations, one in high school, and an anonymous report is how Mike Green phrased it for the issue at Virginia. What did you hear? Because you're at the combine, and there's no way, man, that people weren't talking about this, right? Like, this is a polarizing prospect. This is a guy who could go as high as like 8, 7, 15. Or if these things are on his profile, man, there's teams that could take him right off their board entirely, correct?
Yeah, correct. Look, I don't know the exact details of what happened or what Mike Green did or did not, but I do know some teams took him off their board, and I don't know what they found in their digging and their investigations, but I do think that having that in your past, it's going to be tough for teams to get past, even if maybe not all of it is true. It seems like there's at least part of it or some of it that could potentially be true and potentially happen. But again, we won't know those things. They probably won't be made public.
Right.
But some teams don't feel comfortable with that. And I think there were a few teams that kind of asked about it, and I don't think they got the answers they were looking for. But I can say that a few teams have taken them off the board, which is understandable. It's a tough. And I kind of want to be careful here, but the accusation, whether these are true or not, I think teams don't want sometimes players that may have been involved in that, in any sort of degree. So yeah, there's a few teams that took Mike Green off their board, but I don't think it's going to cause him to drop out of the first round entirely, at least the way I see it currently.
Gotcha. And yeah, I do want to reiterate. I wasn't trying to put you on the spot there. I appreciate the ginger tact that you moved in with that, because when nobody knows. You said it, at the beginning of this, that no one knows the facts other than Mike Green and anyone else that was involved in these alleged altercations or instances. And I'm not trying to condemn anybody, especially a young man who's trying to, make his dreams come true. You also don't want to completely overlook the seriousness of the allegations and what is kind of being talked about. So it is a difficult thing to maneuver. I appreciate how you worded all of that. And the teams will have to decide on their own what they're comfortable with. And what I had read was the same thing that you just mentioned. The answers that some teams got about these things weren't exactly the way that they wanted the answers to go. So maybe it's just an uneasiness, right? It could even just be a thing where they're saying, hey, we're not condemning him. We're not saying that we think that everything happened, but we also just don't know that we want to invest in somebody that we're not 100% sold on.
So looking at our consensus board, he's at 13, edge 4 behind Abdul Carter, Jalen Walker, and really just back to back with James Pierce Jr. I know you mentioned, Devin, that teams might have him off their board. So knowing that some teams may still have him on their board, and you said he might still be a round 1 pick, where do you have him, and where do you think the NFL has him?
Yeah, I have him inside my top 20. I think, the thing with Mike Green is that I really liked him a lot and even liked his game. And I knew he would kind of rise into that first round conversation. But I never saw a top 10 player, and that's just me personally. Like, I really like him. I really like his skill set, but I feel more comfortable taking him in that 15 to 20 range. So I still think most of the NFC South teams should be in the market for him. The Falcons.
We're all terrible at pass rush.
I think the Falcons should be in invested in him. I think the Buccaneers should be invested in him. I think the Cardinals should be invested in him. Like, I think any team in really in that 10 to 15, 10 to 19 range should be in the market for him, because I think he's a really good player. He's a guy that still relatively young. I think he's a guy that is going to continue to develop as a run defender as well. But I see him inside the top 20. Obviously just based on what we know about his film and what he brings to the table. The character things and things off the field, obviously that needs to be sorted out. But solely as a film grade, I think he's a top 20 player.
From a schematic standpoint, or even an alignment standpoint, right? Because at Virginia, I'm not super familiar with the defense that they were running in 2021 when he was there. There's not really any film for him on that, but they had him labeled as an outside linebacker, right? Not as a defensive end. You get into Marshall, and he's more of a D lineman. Is there anything that you see from him on tape? We know about the athleticism. It pops off. He didn't do any of the testing drills to kind of look at some of those like agility drills or anything like that. Is there anything that would make you think that he could play outside linebacker at the next level? Or is he pretty much a, look, man, you're going to be like a wide 9 stand up or 7 tech? Like how does he fit in a defensive scheme at the next level?
I think naturally, like a wide 9, 7 technique makes a lot of sense. But I do think, he has the frame and the kind of the change of direction ability to drop in the coverage. I will say, watching his tape from 2023, I think there was a little bit more, I guess, a little bit more coverage snaps for him, where he was dropping back into coverage and kind of play a spy role and being a little bit more, playing in space. But I do think, his obviously his strength and what he will be at the NFL level as a pass rusher moving forward. But if I was a 3-4 team, I wouldn't be, turned away from the thought of potentially having him as an outside linebacker type of player at the NFL level, because I certainly think he has the frame to do it, the athleticism to do it, and there's some limited tape on him in dropping into coverage. But obviously this year they wanted him to rush the passer, especially on third downs, and really get after the quarterback.
I like that you bring up the strength aspect too. And Edgar, sorry, I didn't mean to jump in before you got your question here, but
you're good.
There's such a misconception about Mike Green that he's weak or that he's all speed, right? He's not, man. I mean, this is a strong dude. You can see the power. He does speed to power well, but then you look at just from like a actual strength standpoint, he did do the bench press at the combine, and the dude put up 28 reps of 225 pounds. That's not a weak person by any stretch of the means. I mean, Jordan Phillips, the nose out of Maryland, who was on Feldman's freak list, who I think Mike Green was as well, if I remember correctly. He put up 29 at 320 pounds, right? So, like, if you're talking about a strength thing, Mike Green he's got that element to him.
Yeah, I don't think he's as much of a finesse player as he's thought out to be. He's a physical guy. You saw it at the Senior Bowl. You saw it, at times on his tape. He's willing to embrace contact and take guys head on, take blocks head on. He's not always just trying to run around and get around, players and trying to turn the corner.
That's a great point, because that's one of my favorite things about him in the run defense is that his willingness for collision. I mean, he will go straight into it. He is not trying to avoid impact. He will blow up a blocker and do his part of the dirty work.
So if we jump into some of his analytics, I mean, his production is insane. Again, all this, just like Roz, just like all these different metrics we're looking at, these are just pieces to the puzzle. These are not the end all be all. Anyone who is in the top right quadrant is going to be a Hall of Famer, right? These are just more data points to look at. But in terms of his production based on PFF, this is put together by an awesome account, Gridiron Grading. But XY, the average for all edge rushers since 2015, he's far exceeds everybody else in terms of run defense and pass rush production. Also from Gridiron Grading, they did their own scores, but straying away from the scores. He's their second rated edge rusher, right below Abdul Carter, but pass rush win rate in terms of true pass sets, 31%. And this is, again, in comparison to all edge rushers drafted since 2015, super high elite level pass rush win rate in just in all plays, 20%. Pressures per season, 44. His run defense grade from PFF is 90. Tackles per season, 42. And so he's just incredible. I know that someone that I'm familiar with, Marcus Mosher, he put together also the highlights from what you see from PFF. He has here, let's pull up here. He said, like, hey, tackles for loss, it's a really good metric to see. And most people who succeed in that area tend to do well in the NFL. He's tops in this class with 1.77. On top of that, those 23 tackles for loss, he also had 17 sacks. So, like, again, just super productive, just super impressive. And then one more here. We've got, again, the stable numbers from PFF. Just these percentiles are just off the charts, right? Run defense grade, 99th percentile. Pressure is 99th percentile. Pass rush win rate, 96th percentile. And true pass sets win rate, he's rushing. He still wins, and he's in the 95th percentile. And his pass rush grade in the 93rd percentile. So just his projection's off the charts.
I want to make note, too, that first thing that you showed, there was another name that we talked about. And Devin, I won't put you on the spot and ask you too much about this guy, but David Walker is a guy that I'm very much intrigued by. And you talked about your proclivity to kind of like identify these smaller school prospects and that you enjoy that aspect of the draft. David Walker's a fun guy too, right?
Yeah, he's a guy that plays with a lot of power. You don't really think of a small school guy being kind of that power type of player. And he would, really use his hands. He got some heavy hands, and obviously he has some athleticism and some ability to win on the inside track too with a swim move. But yeah, he's a guy that's like extremely powerful, has enough speed to turn the corner. So I'd be interested to see what his testing numbers are when he does his Central Arkansas pro day. So I think he's a guy too that maybe if you don't get a Mike Green or one of those top edge rushers, you can get him in round 3 or round 4, and still have a guy for the long term that can be a part of your pass rush rotation.
Like the way you think. I had to get my own personal agenda in there because that's another draft crush for me. So I was like, while I got the guy here, man, I've got to at least find out what he thinks about David Walker. All right. So with Mike Green, let's talk about specific. Well, you talked about the teams, right? And you talked about him being in your top 20, or he would grade out as a top 20 film type player. On draft day, you don't think that this guy falls out of the first round, right?
I think right now, no. Like unless we hear things more substantial, like I think there's a lot of question marks, and that teams will only really be able to find out. So to me, unless I hear something that just completely you know I will preface it and say, like, it's certainly possible, but I think a edge rusher of his caliber, um, you just don't miss on that guy in the first round, and unless you think he can't be a guy in your organization, or a guy that uh, can't get past those past mistakes he may have made. So I think right now I certainly see him as a first round guy. Where he goes in the first round, I think, is a big question mark. But at the very least, I think a team will end up liking what they hear from him, like what he brings to skill set wise, and end up taking him in the first round.
Did you have a player comp or a physical profile comp or anything in mind for him? And like, I love comps because they're fun. They kind of give like fans an idea of like, hey, this guy plays this way, or he's the same size as this player, and maybe it alerts them to the kind of player he could be at the NFL. But it doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to have the career as that same person. But I just like the
Yeah,
comp part of it.
yeah. I think right now it's tough to say. I see Hassan Reddick in the chat. That's an interesting one. I just don't know if there's anybody, at least recently for me, that I have seen that kind of match exactly what he looks like or brings to the table. He's kind of a tough one to nail down, just because I feel like he's so unique as a player, like in the way that he wins, and the way that he rushes the passer, but still also was able to be physical in the run. So that one was a tough one to nail to me. I didn't have anything in particular in mind.
Yeah.
And nobody really came to mind as I was watching him. I just knew, and you could tell he was good. He was going to be a really good player, but yeah, he's a tough one.
He's just havoc producing, you know.
So, anything else that we want to close on with Mike Green? Did we cover everything, Ricky?
I feel like with Mike, that's about all there was. Devin, did you have anything else from the combine that you found super interesting? Like, was there anything that stood out? The conversations, maybe a prospect that the public is like wildly off on compared to what you're hearing?
I mean, I don't know about anybody wildly off on, but I do think that like Jahad Campbell, like a lot of teams have him going in the top 15, top 20. I think that was a little bit of surprise hearing at the combine, and obviously he tested the way he did, and it makes a lot of sense. But to me, he seemed like a guy that maybe was a late first round type of player coming into the week, but it sounds like he's not going to get outside the top 20. When it's all said and done. I think teams still view Will Campbell as a tackle, despite some of the chatter around him moving to guard. He was obviously asked about it, and obviously, a guy is going to say, "I want to stay at the tackle I'm supposed to be at." But in general, I think he's a guy that the teams still see as a tackle, and still see even with some of the expected measurements coming in. I don't think it deterred teams away from potentially selecting him and selecting him in the first round, and keeping him at tackle. I heard some murmurs about Armand Membu being the first tackle that teams are ranked, and obviously the testing that he did on Sunday obviously kind of backs that up. But even coming into the week, some teams had him as the first offensive lineman that could potentially come off the board, which I found a little surprising. He's a guy I felt like is steadily rose in the draft process. And then looking at defensive backs, I think a lot of teams have Benjamin Morrison as a day 2 grade. I think a lot of people expected, if he was healthy, if the medicals checked out, that he still might find a way in the first round. But teams seem to firmly have a day 2 grade on him, and seem like he's a guy that obviously the injury hurt him, but I think even film wise, teams weren't as high on him as the media was.
Interesting.
I had a question for you, Devin, but also like as a pause here, I know there's close to 500 people that are joining us for lunch today, so thank you for being here. If you haven't already, like and subscribe. Thanks for commenting and everything. Also, want to get a break here. Like, if you have any questions for Devin or us, like, please put them in so we could ask Devin while we still have a few moments with him. But my question for you, Devin, and you wrote about it in your article, but there's draft Twitter buzz, and then there's like the real buzz that, like you mentioned, that you're hearing. And so, is there anything to the draft Twitter trends of Mason Graham falling and Shamar Stewart rising?
I will say, I think there's a few teams that are a little bit concerned about Mason Graham's measurables. Like him being a little bit short armed. Him coming, I think, 20 pounds under the weight he played at Michigan. So I think there was some concern there. I don't think he's a guy that necessarily falls out of the top 10, but maybe he does end up going top 5 that we all have seemed to be projecting him at. I think Jacksonville is a popular landing spot for him, but I don't think Jacksonville is as high on him as people seem to think that they are. So I could see him falling out of the top 5 range, and maybe he goes like 9 or 10. I could see a world where that happens. With Shamar Stewart, I think again, teams are split on how good he can be. I think some people kind of gave him the Trayvon Walker comparisons. Some people think like maybe the production is a big red flag. Some teams think that the production isn't sustainable, or the lack of production isn't sustainable, but some think that he has his best football ahead of him. And I think a lot of it has to do with the Texas A&M scheme. They play run first. They focus a little bit more on defending the run, and then I think with him, when you get him out of that scheme per se, I think you see the best out of him. So I think Shamar Stewart's still probably around the 10-15 range that he came into the combine with. I think every team knew he was going to test really, really well athletically because he looks like it on film. So I don't think necessarily that Shamar Stewart rose up boards, quote unquote. I think he's still around the same range that people saw him as.
Yeah, you worked with Jared Feinberg, who we've had on the show before. Now, you guys used to have did you have a draft podcast together too? You and Jared?
Yeah.
If I remember correctly?
Yeah, we did. The Draft Nut podcast, me and him had for I want to say about a year and a half.
Yeah. He's the one that kind of put me on to your work. It was like, dude, you should totally check out like everything that Devin talks about with his draft. Like, if you think that I know my stuff, he's like, learned a lot of stuff from Devin. Jared is very high on Shamar Stewart. He came on here and that was his draft crush. He spoke well about him for a good 45 minutes to an hour, ran through a mock draft on it. If you were looking at Shamar Stewart individually, where do you think that he fits in? Would he be a potential fit for the Carolina Panthers based off of his, what he brings right now as the floor of a run defender, like you talked about, but also that high ceiling as a potential pass rusher?
Yeah, I think so. I think he's a guy that at the very least you're getting a really good run defender early on in his career. Maybe the pass rush comes a little bit later, but I think one of the popular counts with him is Jadeveon Clowney. Panthers obviously had Clowney, and we saw early in his career and coming out of South Carolina, a guy that's a really unique athlete, very long limb, and really explosive linearly. But I think with Shamar Stewart, I see a lot of similarities to their game and being a really good run defender first. I don't think he has, necessarily the top tier bend that you see some of the edge rushers that have come out in the past of his stature. So I think with him, he's going to have to be a little bit more savvy as a pass rusher.
One question I had for you, Devin, because something that way more than we do is tight ends, right? And so You mentioned a little bit in your article, your post combine, but who are some of the sleepers that you're looking at, day 2, day 3 tight ends that you're saying to yourself, man, some team's going to get a really good tight end if they get them in this day 2 or day 3 range?
Yeah, I really like Mason Taylor for Carolina. I think he's a guy that moves really well athletically. A guy that can be able to stretch the seam and be a threat as a vertical receiver. So I really like what he brings to the table as a tight end. And then I look at a guy like Thomas Fredoni, the Nebraska tight end, who I think, if you go back to that class of 2021, in high school, he was a top ranked tight end over Brock Bowers. So to me, he's a guy that is kind of fallen under the radar a little bit because he was battling some knee injuries early in his career, had a little bit of a setback, really didn't get significant snaps until last year and this past year. But he's a guy to me that athletically tested extremely well at the combine, a guy that, showed that ability to be kind of that vertical threat, can create after the catch at Nebraska. But the offense didn't run through him. So he was a guy that was more of a complementary piece. But, when you're projecting tight ends forward specifically, you want to see them and what they're able to do, in a few years versus what they are right now. And I think he still has a lot of room to grow and has that ability to be, a really 3-level threat at the NFL level. So those two guys I really like. Obviously, there's been a lot of buzz around Harold Fannin. I like him as a player. I think he's a guy that, is going to be a little bit more scheme dependent in some of his success at the NFL level, just because I think, obviously the size part of it, but also, I don't think he's quite the natural separator that you expect of a guy of his caliber, but the run after catch ability, what he's able to do working down the seams, there's going to be a role for him at the NFL level.
Well, Devin, thank you so much you've been so generous with your time, your knowledge, everything that you shared. I guess before we go, I'm sure you have a lot of people who want to support you. Like, what are some of the things that they can do to support you, or where can they find your work?
Yeah, you can find me on X at @RealD_Jackson. You can find all of my work at Inquirer.com. I do a lot of draft stuff this time of year. I'll be doing like some positional rankings. Probably do a few more mock drafts. Just working on some player profiles, things like that. I'll be doing a lot of that over the next few months and what they bring to the table.
Appreciate your time, man. Incredible perspective and insight as always. We'll be watching the rest of your content for the rest of the draft period, man.
Yeah, absolutely. Appreciate your guys' time. And always, like I said, always happy to come on and talk NFL draft and, be happy to come on again and chat with you guys again.
Love it. All right, Edgar, should we hit the fancy little closeout intro video?
Yeah, so that closes another episode of Draft Crush. Hopefully you enjoyed our conversation. Like and subscribe, comment. Devin, thank you for your time. And with that, that closes the end of Draft Crush Show.